Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
What comes to your mind when someone mentions colonial America? Is it people like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Patrick Henry or John Adams? Maybe it's the Pilgrims. Or how about places? Boston and Plymouth Rock, Philadelphia or Jamestown, Williamsburg. I mean, they've certainly done a great job of promotion. Or how about events like the Boston Massacre or the Tea Party or Concord or Lexington? Or even Roanoke predating Jamestown. I consider that an event because there's never been closure. I mean, what happened? All of those thoughts are correct. There's no wrong answer. But they're very limited, representing quote-unquote common ideals. Notice, though, they're mere bookends. The examples are either early 17th century or the latter half of the 18th century. I mean, it's no wonder they're bigger-than-life personalities, nostalgic places representing monumental cultural shifts. It's all very English. What was the common unifying force? What differentiated the colonies from their neighbors? Who was the common enemy? I mean, was there a common enemy? One single enemy. One single unifying enemy of a pristine people with ultra-clean hands, bloodless hands. What of the question of unity, solidarity? I mean, 13 colonies, one distinct vision. The knee-jerk response might be England, or more specifically, King George III. One massive, unified movement bursting with public support. I mean, a true David and Goliath narrative. Now, we've mentioned the predictable ideals, the bookends for colonial America, right? I mean, these familiar images of the early 17th century and then again later in the 18th century. But what happened in between? I want to start to frame a narrative with questions, lots of questions. I mean, what was it like? Was life uniform? Would the geography of the colonies even allow for that? I mean, the fact is there were geographic differences, principles and goals and ideals and climates and professions and religious conviction and struggle. It could be said the New World, the New English world, was founded on two primary factors: religion and economics. I mean, money and the ability to pursue both as one saw fit. You had Puritans and Quakers and Anglicans and Methodists and Baptists and Catholics and merchants and artisans, idealists and dreamers. Colonial America was an adventurer's dream, no matter what adventure you dreamed. What was the common life like? Or more aptly, what happened? What experiences became common in colonial America? What moved the people, the common folk across the countryside? I mean, were there certain regions that were more inclined to change than others? And if so, why is that? I mean, the goal had been to come to a new world and start a new life. And it was understood that that would be hard. But was the slate in the New World clean? I mean, were they really starting from a clear canvas? The answer to that question is no. I mean, there were already people here, a lot of people. To start with, you had native tribes, too many to name here, but we're going to deal with those as chronology and geography dictates. And there were the Europeans, the Spanish and the French and the Dutch, and some Germans and Croatians and Scandinavians. The English took a while to dominate North America, but they brought a stronger, more pronounced sense of permanency with them for religious liberty and money. The two things that people most comfortably seemed to kill and die to obtain. And political self-rule was also emphasized. The question that I have is, did the founders and their generation, I mean, by generation, the political thought, the philosophical ideals, ideas on taxation and representative government, citizenship, I mean, did they just emerge from nowhere? Did George Washington and his cronies just emerge on the scene with fully mature views out of nowhere? And if not, what happened? How were their views of the world they lived in shaped? What common experiences did they share? I mean, when you think about it, what does an aristocratic Englishman from Virginia have in common with an artisan, a tradesman from Boston? What of the differences in experience between the larger central cities and towns and forts versus the interior, the explorers and the woodsmen, the traders and trappers, those on the front lines of diversity and competition and cross-cultural experiences? Some very pivotal people and regions and actions, events both in Europe and North America that we really seldom consider collided. Like most things, we tend to boil down our thoughts of colonial America, its people, to the least common denominator, to generalities. Like, it was really hard times for the Pilgrims. They're so pious and such tough people. Or, boy, Virginia sure did prosper. You've got to admire the merchants of Boston. They were very productive and industrious. The Quakers in Pennsylvania, they sure were tolerant and prosperous. I mean, the people, the people of the storybooks, the colonial Americans, that is, were tough and prosperous. They were productive and industrious. The French were jerks. The Indians, they could be helpful, but they were savages and barbaric and mostly uniform. The Dutch were okay. They just weren't here very long, right? The English were great until they weren't, until the founders' generation. And then they changed. The English became belligerent with the 13 colonies for no good reason, very abusive. But in the end, they got theirs. I mean, isn't that a common narrative? It might be a little exaggerated, but only a little. The question is that an accurate narrative? I mean, to understand and appreciate our founding, we want to explore and flesh out and distill down not all of the aspects, but enough of those to a granular level, using many of the names and places and events with some added names and places and events as the building blocks to a better house, a surer foundation of our understanding. See, although the study of each colony or region of colonial America brings with it a certain specific story, each adding to the tapestry of our heritage, there are some very specific regions and events that were truly the catalyst for our fight for independence, our emerging self-awareness, our identity. And these did not occur in rapid fashion over 1 or 2 generations, but over several generations, 150 years or more. Events that framed the ideals that carried us to independence. Now, to begin, I want to develop a train of thought. I want to connect a series of events that played key roles in our national development. We want to consider them in layers, kind of like the old transparencies of the human body in the encyclopedia. You remember, if you're, of age where they had encyclopedias when you were growing up. I used to love looking through the anatomy of the human body. You had the layer of the bones and then the muscles and the arteries and the veins. That's how I look at history, like those transparencies, each layer adding to the layer below it. The histories of Jamestown and Plymouth have their place, and so too Boston and Philadelphia and Concord. The chronology of the people and the events of the 1760s and 70s are critical. But the in-between years, between Plymouth and Concord, the people, the places, the events, they're not only important, they're essential as to why independence was declared, and the story's extraordinary. Much of the galvanizing in North America finds its roots in European rivalries, in rural atrocities and westward expansion. Ultimately, control of North America was between the British and French monarchies. European superpowers who had fought a series of 4 wars in about 60 years, none of which produced a decisive victory, none of which solved the question of global colonial claims and dominance, including the claims in North America. That would be decided by what will turn out possibly to be the defining, most galvanizing event in colonial America, the catalyst to the American Revolution. I'm talking about the French and Indian War, which was really a preamble and the North American theater, the beginning of hostilities that would become Europe's 7 Years' War, a true world war. The French and Indian War began over disputed claims in the Ohio Valley. The principal belligerents included the colonies of Pennsylvania and Virginia, as well as France and multiple Native American tribes. In an attempt to begin to frame our early discussions, I want to read a quote from one source. It's an introduction to a book called The French and Indian War. It's the author's note, and it reads in part, quote, "The French and Indian War was a fight for North America. Although Europeans viewed the conflict as an unimportant sideshow to the war on their continent, it was of tremendous concern to Americans and Canadians. Many Indian tribes became involved, but their viewpoints were limited and confused. They were anxious to be on the winning side, and in the end, they lost." Unquote. The book's pretty good. I take issue, though, with the discounting of the quote-unquote Indian viewpoints being quote-unquote limited and confused. I don't believe that careful consideration will bear this out. Rather, I would say that it's a mistake to simplify the concerned parties to only 3 considerations, English, French, and Indians, as if they represent only one common interest. These are more accurately to be viewed as multiple nations with many objectives and distinctions. Perhaps a more accurate narrative would be that the native people were without one true unified voice. They were collectively outnumbered by their European counterparts, fighting continuous wars between each other as well as the Europeans, and they were vulnerable. And I want to take some time to develop this idea because I think it's important. The practical truth of the matter and its ramifications, not just on the Indians, but all of the parties involved. The French were relatively united, and the British colonies were not always on the same page. In fact, often they had very different goals. Sometimes they directly competed with each other. The various geographies and religious views and economies and backgrounds made for a very diverse population that was intent not just on permanent settlements, but expansion. Region by region, industry by industry, local opposition was the focus. You can approach American history from a variety of concepts, and they're all valid. My fascination usually centers around the events that galvanized the colonies into declared armed resistance in 1776. What happened? When did these events happen, and why did these events take place? Because history's like a puzzle. It's made up of various pieces. And the more pieces you assemble, the clearer the picture becomes. No matter where you start, it's always in the middle of somewhere else. So background and context is necessary. And there's 2 areas that I want to look at before we develop the French and Indian War. Maybe it's one big area. Maybe it's fairer to say that it's several areas. I don't know. We'll figure that out as we go. But the first region of our focus will be what we recognize today as New England. And the second region is much bigger. The epicenter will be modern New York State, but its tentacles will at times reach up into Canada, and it may take our attention south all the way to Virginia, and it will certainly involve Pennsylvania. I think it's important to lay out at least a partial consideration of the major players during these times. Now, remember, the two basic concepts that we're going to develop are one, how the official 13 British colonies galvanized, and two, demonstrate that the Indian tribes' viewpoints were anything but limited and confused. They acted with as much intention and necessity as their European counterparts. Now, I do admit I might be taking the point a little too far when I take such an exception to the idea that the Indians had limited and confused viewpoints. But I can't help but consider the old stereotype of ignorant savages being played by their superior European counterparts. I mean, that's a stereotype that does not hold up under scrutiny. So let's begin to list and think about the various people that were involved in our story. I mean, I want to develop the regions of New England and New York separately for now because there's a different cast of characters. We want to paint with a broad brush here, or at least reserve the right to. I mean, we have a set of goals to tend to. I do plan to circle back at some point and more fully develop the colonial landscape. I mean, possibly in another format. We talked about maybe doing a video series. But what we want to do here is to identify the groups kind of as a refresher or maybe a primer so that I can work through the narrative without always trying to develop some new group, right? I mean, we want to get a handle on who was here. Now, some of this is going to be review, but some will be new information, kind of presenting a new lens to look through, fresh consideration, reframing the narrative from the perspective of a general ethno-European perspective. I mean, why did the Europeans come here? What was happening in Europe? You see, at the dawn of the 17th century, Europe was in the midst of not one or two, but several massive cultural shifts. From the beginning of the Crusades, when Christian Europe united, and the Saxons gave way to the Normans in England, to the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215, to the Renaissance, where Europe, beginning in Italy, experienced a renewed interest in classical learning and values, the times of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and William Shakespeare, artists and inventors and literary observers and critics of human character, Gutenberg's printing press. He wasn't original. I mean, China had it much earlier. And a form of humanism from men like Erasmus, challenging the religious orthodoxy and focusing on human nature. His New Testament was excellent, and he was the target of Luther's bondage of the will. Sadly, these great public confrontations are not even remembered today, but they gave us the world that we inherited and still influence us today. His criticisms of ecclesiastical abuses helped to encourage both the Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, both of which found their respective places and representatives in the New World. The empiricists like England's Bacon and the rationalists like Francis Rousseau were soon to arrive on the scene, competing views with each other and centuries of European tradition. Hundreds of years of incremental but foundational events had shaped and reshaped the social and the religious and the political landscapes across the continent and throughout the British Isles. I mean, think about this. The union with England and Wales was only a century old, but the United Kingdom of England and Scotland was 100 years away, and the United Kingdom of England and Ireland, 200. As we consider the colonization of North America by the Europeans, in light of these events, let's think about the people who were here and the people who came. First and foremost, those that were here, the Indians. And I mean no disrespect by that term. Depending on what year your history books were written in, you may see different terms, but they're all the same people groups. You could call them First Nationers or Native Americans or indigenous tribes. These were distinct people groups, and I wanted to develop them as we go, not out of disrespect for developing them here or intentionally neglecting or marginalizing them, but rather there's many groups who come and go, And it's easier to introduce them as they appear on the scene because of the parameters that we've placed on our goal, and that's colonial unity. I mean, what happened to the indigenous people collectively in North America was tragic. They were victims of an invasion. They weren't stupid. They weren't guiltless either. But displacement is not unusual in human history. I mean, population migrations happen, and they're usually contested, even amongst the native tribes, as we'll see. The reality is, diseases brought by Europeans devastated their populations more than warfare. And manipulation and betrayal and greed on both sides displaced many, while at the same time reducing their ranks, causing mourning wars and perpetuating hostilities, as well as diluting tribal identities. I mean, with or without European influence, the tribes could be brutal to one another. But unstoppable expansion of European settlers caused a ripple effect within the native populations as one tribe moved into another's land to avoid the Europeans. I think of men like Crazy Horse or Osceola, who will come much later in our narrative. But their stories still have the ability to capture the imagination. Their legends demand respect, and their betrayals were heartbreaking. And the second group that I want to mention briefly here is either indigenous or African slaves who were here almost from the start. Their history and stories stand in a stark contrast to the quote-unquote heroic exploits of those who lived not in bondage to another, but often as free as any man has ever been. A most striking contrast that I hope to define as we move through our narrative. I think the broader race relations discussion is so wide and so vast and so sensitive an issue that it requires really careful consideration. I mean, to this day, we don't seem to have fully figured that out. I mean, if you're not bothered by the historical account of American slavery, you may not have given it enough thought. Maybe this narrative will help. Because it's not just America's problem. Many countries benefited from colonial slavery, and many cultures and places around the world still practice similar methods. The third group that I just want to talk about briefly here is a group that's not always considered on an even par with the English and the French, and that's the Spanish. I mean, mostly south of the border. That's kind of the way we view them. But they did claim large areas of the current United States of America. Out west, certainly, but also the mouth of the Mississippi River and large areas of Florida and the southeast. They arrived in 1492, the famous voyage of Christopher Columbus. For our purposes, they established the city of St. Augustine, Florida in 1565. You know, it remains the oldest European city in the United States. And they expanded into Georgia and South Carolina a little bit later. They founded Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1610, and they were in California and Texas. The Spanish came and they served at the pleasure of the crown. Very strict order was kept. There was no self-rule. Spanish colonies were ruled by crown-appointed governors or viceroys. These were Catholic colonies. Protestants were forced out. Now, originally, the Spanish presence was limited to military and missionary people, with the traders and the farmers coming later. These were business ventures, and commerce was controlled by the Board of Trade. Laws were enforced by the military, very strict compared to the English colonies, which flourished. The Spanish did not tend to get along well with the native populations that they encountered. I mean, they saw them as heathens. They were in need of either conversion, subjugation, or death. Spanish colonial populations grew very slowly. I mean, it's not hard to understand why under those conditions. But I don't know if the Spanish get enough consideration in popular history. At least not in the popular history that I grew up with in the northeast of the United States. I'm not sure if they get enough respect. I mean, they were successful in accomplishing what they wanted to for a long time. I'm not commenting here on their behavior. And they enjoyed a longevity that outlasted the French and the English. and they were allies of the American colonials of the rebellion in 1776. They are given credit as being the first here, but realize they influenced a huge geography in South and Central and North America. They maintained Florida for many years after the War of 1812, until Andrew Jackson invaded and was ultimately appointed the military governor in 1821. They weren't officially and permanently expelled from their last North American claims until 1898's Spanish-American War. That's almost a century after England and a century and a half after France. We'll develop Spain a little bit more as we look at some of the other players in our story. Fourthly, I want to look at the French. They represented the greatest existential threat to the English hegemony and control for 100 years. Their approach was both similar and vastly different from the Spanish, and the English for that matter. Like the Spanish, New France was Catholic, and population growth was slow, and they were beholden to the crown. But unlike Spain, they were intentional in their efforts to build alliances with the natives. Contrasted with Spain and England, France enjoyed pretty good relations with the native people. They had arrived in the 1530s and 40s, so a few decades after the Spanish, and they did not try to change the natives or compete with them for land. Their intent originally was simply seasonal fur trading. They kind of joined the commercial enterprise that was going on. They received furs, and they offered finished European goods in exchange, like cooking pots or weapons, the gunpowder type, and horses. They learned from the natives. They learned to hunt and to trap, but they also learned language and culture. In short, they ingratiated themselves to the native populations, and they treated them as equals. It does seem reasonable, but this was not the norm in the 17th century. The concepts of evangelism and permanent settlements came later. The French did not begin to stay year-round until the first decades of the 17th century. Their first permanent settlement was in 1608, the year after Jamestown. They settled Quebec without displacing any natives. Now think of that in terms of your homeland. How would that be if a strange people group came into your homeland and displaced you to build their own cities and towns? The French intermarried at a greater rate than other European groups. Compared to their French counterparts, the English treated the natives as inferior, much like the Spanish, and they tried to forcibly control them by English law. The natives tended to side with the French in their conflicts. It's easy to understand why. To most, the concept of New France began with Jacques Cartier in 1534. Now, he was commissioned to find gold and spices and a passage to Asia, which was also the same target of the Dutch and the English, but instead he explored the North American coast and the St. Lawrence River. New France's greatest explorer, however, was Samuel de Champlain. He was a contemporary and a competitor, geographical overlapper, really, of Henry Hudson, the famed English explorer who sailed for and made major contributions to both English and Dutch interests. We'll talk a little bit more about him later. Champlain is remembered as the father of New France. You remember I said that the concept of a New France began with Jacques Cartier, but Champlain's recognized as the father. And as I said, he founded Quebec in 1608. He discovered the lake that bears his name in 1609, and he promoted the fur trade with the Indians. Champlain was found in Canada and New York and New England. He made an enemy of the Iroquois, which will be a very pivotal part of our story later on, because of his friendliness with the northern Indians, the Hurons and the Ottawas. There was an event in 1609, as a matter of fact, that set the stage for so much history, so much drama, so much bloodshed, and ultimately English dominance. Champlain died in 1635 in the city of Quebec. It's with Samuel de Champlain that we see both a great opportunity for a break and also a segue to our next discussion: the introduction and development of the final two players, heavyweights for their time, in our narrative of the unification of the British North American colonies. And that is really where it starts to get exciting. In our next discussion, we will begin to develop the unique relationship between some of the early English colonials and their Dutch counterparts, and how those relationships fractured, and how competition grew, and how the English grew to dominate, not just in their original colonies, but the Dutch as well. Fascinating stuff, fascinating times. I hope that you'll join me.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.